At Vipla Foundation, I've been working with them closely. We decided to study in the area that we have been working with children. And what a small study brought out is today presented to you as its report titled Stressed Out Childhood. So what did the pandemic mean for children? There were mass school closures, and the closure was very sudden. There was no planning, there was no indication. It just happened overnight. Children were doing different things. Some were getting enrolled to start a new session in early childhood school stage, primary, upper primary, and some were appearing in exams, different parts of India. So the closure was sudden. Teachers, principals, and children, parents had no time to really plan. The closure also meant that suddenly they had no interaction with their teachers, with the peer group, neighborhood peer group, as well as the school peer group. And very quickly, TV got promoted, or television viewing got promoted as a tool to force people to stay at home. All kinds of television programs were repeated, retelecast, and many films were retelecast to keep people restricted to home. A study by a market-based organization reported that there was a 300% increase during the midday in TV viewership. Community life and the social support systems were almost dysfunctional. At the same time, in children's families, there was unprecedented unemployment. There was anxiety for survival, and people started migrating in absolutely inhuman conditions and circumstances. When people walked, children walked with their stuff. Many people died while they were walking homes. And on the other side, while humanity struggled to survive, or probably failed, and human beings struggled to survive, digital tools for communication got promoted as means of education. They were promoted as reliable means of education across all age groups, in all the regions, and for children of all socioeconomic groups or class. A mobile phone, which was originally a tool to talk, later which had become for us a tool for entertainment, it got projected as a reliable means to learn as well as to teach. What was specific in India? It was a continuous closure of schools for 17, 18 months. Many countries tried to open, close. Maybe it was chaotic, but children got some experiences during those 17, 18 months of their regular life with teachers and school peer group. But Indian children in all parts of India did not get any such experience. UNICEF's researchers started showing that 42% of children had absolutely no access to learning during these 17, 18 months. Meanwhile, Government of India's own agency, UDISC Plus, released its data, according to which in the pandemic year 2019-20, only 22% schools had internet facilities, while less than 30% had functional computer facilities. So the schools themselves were not able to use what was being projected as a reliable means of teaching children and for ensuring children's learning. A survey called School revealed that only 8% rural children and 24% urban children were studying online. With all this, I would like to present a writer that all these surveys, the entire discourse used mobile or a smartphone as a basis, as a reliable basis to argue whether children were learning or not. Very rarely you would find that this distinction that for a genuine, whatever its scope may be, for a genuine learning to take place through these mediums, a laptop or a desktop is needed. So whatever this data is also largely about mobile phones. With all this, with all these studies and datas coming in, we started to wonder that, so if children, only 8% in rural areas and 24% in urban areas were learning in this medium, which was largely a medium of entertainment, what were others doing? What actually did they do when even these classes hadn't started? So we were curious about children's experiences, their childhood during the pandemic. We undertook a small study involving 150 children and their mothers living in different parts of Mumbai and Thane. We involved mothers because UN for Women and other agencies has already started bringing to our notice that there was a shadow pandemic, the pandemic experienced by women in terms of an increase in the incidence of domestic violence. So we wanted to understand some of home-based experience. Therefore, we involved one of the parents, it is mothers. In our study, children who participated, most of them were 8 to 13 years of age. Some were younger and some were slightly older. Women were largely in 25 to 39 age bracket. The largest group was of women who had 3 to 4 children individually. Out of those women, we found that 25% hadn't studied at all, 56% had barely studied or gone to school for 3 4 years, 11% had studied up to 10th, and 7% had completed grade 12 exams. These interviews with women and children and their mothers were held telephonically. Most these interviews were done by students of education from Delhi University who have a rich experience of interacting with children through their practicum. So most of them had either done B.Ed or M.Ed. What did we do? What was our inquiry? Our inquiry was about what did actually children do during the lockdown in terms of activities. What was their daily routine? How did they we were curious to know how do they describe what all they were doing during the entire day. Reasons for delayed bedtime. We wanted to know if children corroborated that they went to bed late in the night, and if yes, then what were the reasons for that. What kind of interactions they had with their school teachers and classmates. If they studied at home, what did they do? What was their experience, personal experience and familiarity with victims of COVID-19, their knowledge, their familiarity with issues. What did they watch on television during the pandemic when they were largely spending time at home and television, and what did they access for entertainment using their mobile phones. Similarly, we asked women some of the issues about their routine, their activities, kinds of problems, the incidents or familiarity with domestic violence, their personal problems, choice of programs, what did they watch? Because if parents watch, then children also watch additional TV programs. Incidents of forced or incidents of unplanned pregnancies, and the kinds of things that they spoke in telephonic conversations. So we wanted to have an idea that in the background or in the home ethos, what were the kind of issues, anxieties, talks that were being held, what formed the ethos of children during the pandemic. It's a massive data that we have gathered, even if the number of participants is not so big. So today I'll share very limited data with you. We found that it has been an experience of deprivation, especially for the first year, almost 12 months. Deprivation that children expressed in different terms and their mothers expressed in different terms. Just a second. Children expressed that they couldn't study. 49% children couldn't study at all, and 48% couldn't go out to play. They couldn't go to school either. They couldn't play, 49% couldn't play with neighborhood friends or meet them at all. So roughly 50 to 60% children shared with us that usually what they used to do, they couldn't do, which was about going to school, playing at school, studying, and playing with their neighborhood friends. They couldn't meet them. So a childhood was not really a childlike childhood at home. What women reported, or their mothers reported, that they lost their job. 55% women reported that there was no job, there was no earning. And actually, if you see the data carefully, you will find that more than 60% women reported that there was no job to do during the lockdown, which means that there was a restricted income inflow too. We realized that there were hardships as a result of the loss of employment. And women were asked to list those hardships. So obviously there were very generalized answers as well as there were some specific answers. Financial crisis and food crisis. Food hardship emerged as the salient themes. And this is a recurring theme which came out in our study repeatedly in different formats. 46.5% people reported that there was unavailability of food. They had to borrow money. 8% people reported they had to borrow money. And some of them also said that they had to depend on the school to give them food, grains, and even water. Now, close to 50% people reporting unavailability of food brings to us this understanding that the hardship was what children experienced. There are a lot of studies that show that parental unemployment, food hardships in this kind of experiences during early childhood leave a lasting impact on their personalities. It has been measured for cohorts of children in several studies in which the impact on educational attainment, their professional abilities carry on till as late as 30 or 40 years of age. So one of the salient findings of this study is that children who have experienced extreme unemployment, extreme financial crisis, and food hardships, they're sitting with those anxieties. And when they come back to school, the anxieties are not going to disappear just like that. That experience of anxiety is going to continue with them. And we cannot imagine that anxiety gets resolved on its own. We also, when we constructed children's routine by asking them, the dominant experience was for household chores. Almost 58.5% reported that they were busy doing household chores. Then they also reported children like activities of having breakfast, self-study, playing at home with siblings, watching TV, schoolwork, online study, and filling water. Now, this data becomes more meaningful when we segregated it on the basis of gender. And we found that 69.5% girls reported remaining busy with household chores. Their daily routine was largely, they were occupied largely by doing household chores, which was sweeping, mopping, doing dishes, and helping their mother. Only 37.5% boys reported doing household chores. Playing at home with siblings. Interestingly, again, boys reported this, and they were almost 44% boys, whereas 37% girls of the same age group reported playing at home with siblings. 66.6% boys were watching TV, whereas only 20 or 19.5% girls were watching TV. So boys did less of household chores, played more at home with siblings, watched TV even more. And when it comes to online study, only there you find that there is no difference between boys and girls. In fact, girls probably studied slightly more. But when it comes to physical drudgery at home, burdening that responsibility or shouldering that. Girls had to do far more. So the gendered division of household chore again fell back on girls. This is the second important finding, that girls may come back to school even more exhausted. This has been theorized a lot, that every day when girls come to school, they are anyhow exhausted because they work in the morning and go back to household chores again in the afternoon. The pandemic experience at home also meant getting regendered into performing womanly roles. Their mother's routine was also largely about household chores and watching TV. The percentage of women who mentioned household chores and television is at the same 73%. Then came to the taking care of children. And even during the pandemic, they had to get up very early at 4:30 a.m. because filling water has emerged as one of the activities that even children had to do. So it could be because of the settlements in which they live. There is no tap water and they have to go out to fill water. And there is a gender difference in filling water and also in going to tuition. So boys were going more to tuition and girls were filling water more as compared to boys. So there is no difference in the gendered labor that girls had to do. The pattern got repeated. We were interested in knowing what were the kind of programs that women and children watched on television. And TikTok videos emerged as the salient category that children watched. TikTok, I hope all of you remember. Some of you don't even probably fully understand what TikTok videos are. They were banned because they were made on Chinese apps. So during the pandemic, at some point, TikTok videos were banned. And our children have shown familiarity with that ban because they mentioned TikTok videos on YouTube. 43% children watched cartoons and 37% reported TV serials. 20% reported watching news on corona. We probed him further and we asked them about their choice, that what do you like to watch? And that's when the real data came in. The further probing revealed that 49% children liked to watch scary films. Now, scary films or horror films involve very adult like plots, which have murder, rape, violence of all kinds, horrifying images of what mean things adults or people can do to each other. The second category was of horror stories or crime based television programs, Crime Patrol. So if we combine these two, we find that about 77% children have developed a taste or choice or liking towards what we will call very adult programs of thrill, crime and horror. Remaining 11% reported watching corona death on television news. So even in news, what captured their attention is obviously the violent images or not so pleasant images on television news. The people were dying because of fungus. 10% watched cartoons and films and cinema. So what kept children busy is violence on screen at home, and that's what they watched. This was the limited interaction with children over phone, so we couldn't really figure out how much time did they spend watching on these horror programs. But since it emerged as one of the salient activities in their routine, so it looks like a substantial exposure to violence and a sustained experience to violence. So there was violence on the screen, and then there was violence at home. When we asked women about their familiarity with cases of domestic violence, about personal experiences or experience familiarity with victims in their vicinity, 60.5% women agreed upfront that yes, it is there, it happens. Many of them even justified it, saying that, how does it matter? It's my husband. He has a right. Due to alcohol or financial crisis, due to the stress, because there was no food, unavailability of food. And about 40% denied any such experience. So 60.5% experience of domestic violence must be the violence that our children witnessed. And that's how we can say that the third finding is that there was violence that children were consuming in the name of entertainment, and there was violence that children were experiencing firsthand during the pandemic. We asked children about fears. What did they feel scared of? Did they feel scared of anything? And they expressed, yes, that they were scared that they might catch corona. They were scared seeing death on television. They were scared that police might catch them or beat them, because police merciless beating, these kind of images were everywhere in jokes on television, in on WhatsApp, on YouTube, etc. And there were 23% children who mentioned that they were scared that there was no food at home. And this is where mothers reporting of crisis, food hardships, financial crisis, finds a link in the study that 23% were nervous or anxious. They had internalized parents' vulnerability and anxiety, and that they had to depend on others for food. We asked them if they knew, when we were interviewing them in July, if they knew there were children in crisis. So 27% children knew that there was still somebody in their vicinity, their friend or a neighborhood child who was in crisis. And so the fear, violence, fear, and the familiarity with somebody in crisis. Now we know that children don't distinguish, children don't cognitively think that crisis is somebody else's, I am safe. Others' crisis, my friends, my cousins, my neighbor's crisis makes me nervous. That's the impression in childhood. We asked them about the experience or the knowledge, understanding of virus, their perceptions, their familiarity, and we find that they did not know much. They were pretty ignorant. 43% of them clearly said that they did not know much. I mean, 8 to 16-year-old children uh, should have gathered some skills of knowledge construction, having been to school for so many years. But 43% of them upfront said they did not know much. Others said the superficial things like lockdown is because of coronavirus, it's a disease, and COVID patients just simply die. You need to wear masks, you need to use sanitizers, etc. So what they had heard in public announcements, in television announcements, etc., that's what they repeated. But the real understanding they hadn't developed. So we wanted to know, we asked them if they wanted to know more, if they wanted to know further, and about 20% of them clearly said they did not want to know. So they were scared of it. They had suffered, they had seen people in crisis, but 20% of them denied any interest. They were not curious to know. 48.5% children said yes, they wanted to know, and then they gave details of how did it happen, when will it end, how did it get communicated, how does it travel so much, etc. So about 50% of them expressed childlike curiosity. 20% is a very telling data. How does it happen that children lose their curiosity? Probably they remind us of our school reality, where real life and school life go like parallel streams. They don't meet. Children learn very early in life, in their school life, that what happens in my real life doesn't become a matter of inquiry or study or knowledge at school. So these children have probably maintained these two parallel streams in their mind, and they showed no curiosity to know. We asked mothers about the possibility. Sorry. We asked mothers about the possibility of children joining school after the pandemic is over, when the schools open. And that's when we found a trajectory in making. There were about 40% parents who clearly said that their children will go to school, they will not stay at home. But there were about 25% who said that things are uncertain. We don't know. If they cannot study, we will make them either do part-time job or they can simply go to work. UNICEF data about child marriage, about increase in child labor, all that is already available to us. And we finally conclude that the experience of children during the pandemic has been of the one being restricted to home physically, socially. They have watched internalized violence and have witnessed violence. They have coped with household drudgery. Girls have coped more. There is fear, there is anxiety, and there is experience of crisis. But there has been a lack of knowledgeable adults, wherein they could have asked, they could have voiced that, to whom they could have voiced their anxieties, with who they could have discussed, asked questions. And so there was neither the ethos, the knowledge-based or social safe ethos that school provides, nor were there knowledgeable adults around them. That's how we have called it a stressed out childhood. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gupta. I would now like to invite our panelists to please share their thoughts on this research piece, so that as contributors in the education sector, all of us can benefit. And it will surely, I believe, the insights that we have gained from the research and the what we'll gain from each of our panelists will help us work on our strategies for the upcoming years in the education sector, so that we can impact children in a better way as we face this situation now. So I would like to invite Professor Jean Drees to go ahead and speak first.
Thank you, Meenu.
Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Latika Gupta, for this very interesting and enlightening presentation and for conducting the study. It really resonates with me because many of the findings are quite similar to a study that I was involved in recent months, which we have cited actually, called the School Survey. But it also takes the findings forward in important ways, particularly in bringing out the predicament of children in urban communities. I'll come back to that, but I thought that since I'm the first speaker, I should perhaps share some general remarks first, because I think that we are really today in a very extraordinary and catastrophic situation. And when I refer to the situation, I'm not only referring to the fact that the schools have been closed now for the best of 18 months, and they're still closed in some states, although they're reopening in many other states. So that is one part of the crisis, but it's only the beginning. I think another extraordinary aspect of the situation today is that there has been, there's some background noise. Somebody needs to mute. I think Vivek needs to mute. So I was saying that this prolonged closure of schools is one thing, but what is perhaps even more extraordinary is how little attention has been paid to this and how little discussion there has been of this education crisis. In fact, until around August of this year, there was hardly any public awareness of the problem. Another indication of this lack of concern is the fact that perhaps not all of you know that the budget of the school education department was reduced this year by about 10%, even as the overall budget of the union government increased by almost 20%. And again, there was hardly any discussion of that in the post-budget discussions in February. And then again, another indication of the crisis and the lack of attention being paid to it is the casual manner in which schools are being reopened now in many states without any major changes in pedagogy or curriculum to help children who have been excluded from the schooling system for such a long time. Now, I think all this tells us some disturbing things about education policy and Indian society. The first pattern is the indifference of privileged classes towards the education of poor children. I think that is the only way of understanding what is going on and the lack of attention that has been paid to this massive education crisis. And of course, there is a long history in India of this indifference. For a very long time. Education, in fact, was a virtual monopoly of the upper castes well into the 20th century. But we thought that we had overcome that, I think, with elementary education becoming a fundamental right and every child having a legal right to go to school until the age of 14. But I think what we are realizing today is that that pattern of indifference continues. The second pattern which follows from that is that education policy is made to a large extent for privileged children. Their situation is very different from the situation of poor children, but education policy is mainly geared to the better off children. And in the last 2 years, this has taken the form of an overwhelming reliance on online education and very little being done to reach out to children who didn't have the opportunity to study online. They were basically dropped like hot potatoes and left with very little means of continuing their studies. Third general pattern is the lack of seriousness in the schooling system, of which there are many symptoms. Today, the main symptom is, as I mentioned earlier, the way in which the schools are being reopened and an effort is made to return to business as usual as quickly as possible, with children being simply catapulted 2 grades ahead of the grades in which they were enrolled in before the lockdown, without any major changes in curriculum and pedagogy or any serious arrangements being made to enable them to cope with this.
I think his connection.
After all,
Professor Trey, sorry to interrupt you, but your connection, we had lost you in between.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize. Should I just continue?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I was saying the last point is that we are learning, I think, is the weakness of civic cooperation and community initiative in the field of education, because after all, in most communities, in most villages, in most extended families, even there are educated youngsters who could have done something to help children to continue studying, but we have seen rather little of that. Even within the family, in the survey that we had done last August, we found many families where some of the elder siblings were relatively well educated, but still they were not doing much to help the younger children to continue studying. So now coming to the study, as I said, it resonated with me because of the similarities with the study that we had done ourselves in the month of August. One of the findings that common to both studies and may be obvious, but is still important to say, is the failure of online education as far as underprivileged children are concerned. We had found, as Latika mentioned, that in rural areas, only 8% of children in poor families were studying online. The figures are not very different in your own survey. They are a little higher, but mainly because you're looking at urban areas. Now, this is important to say because the government and even the Prime Minister keep trying to give the impression that online education saved the day during the crisis and that it is the wave of the future. That may be true for a small minority of privileged children, but it does not apply at all for children of underprivileged families. So it's important to reiterate this. Second point common to both studies is that the offline children, the children who were not able to study online regularly, and by the way, the reasons why they're unable to study online regularly is not just that there's no smartphone. I think you have also observed that. It's also all kinds of other reasons. They may not have money for recharge, they may not have good connectivity, the school may not be sending online study material, and even if the online study material is coming, the children may not understand it, especially the younger children. They may not have the right environment at home. So there are many, many reasons why online education is beyond the reach of most poor children. So the second point is that for the other children, the vast majority of poor children who are not able to study online regularly, very little has been done to help them. And most of them are either not studying at all, about half of the children in your study, same in our study in rural areas. And those who are somehow continuing their studies are mainly doing it in the form of self-study at home. So they sit with their textbooks and they try somehow to continue studying a little bit on their own, but not more than that. So it's not just the connection with the school that has been discontinued, but as you observed, it's also the connection with the teachers. Basically, there was no interaction during this entire 18 months period between poor children and the teachers, except for occasional casual meetings, mainly to do with things like textbooks and scholarships or midday meals and so on, but not to do with education. Thirdly, again, common point of both studies, following on this, the fact that the vast majority of poor children are not able to continue studying is that they are very badly prepared now to go back to school. And I think one of the most worrying finding in your study, which I find frankly quite shocking, is that something like 30 or 35% of mothers are not confident that their children are going to be able to continue studying in school. This is really very worrying, and I think that something really has to be done about this. But as I said, the reopening of schools is very, very casual, and many states are not even doing enrollment drives now to make sure that most of the children are going back to school. Another important insight from your study, which was not there in our study because we were looking mainly at rural children, is the psychological and emotional impact of the school closures on children. I think this is perhaps more of a problem in urban areas than in rural areas, because in rural areas, children tend to have a lot of outdoor space. And in any case, even in ordinary times when the schools are open, they spend a lot of time roaming around, playing with the children, with their friends, maybe doing a little bit of work in the field and so on. So that continued more or less as it was during the COVID crisis, with one difference, that the girl children were doing more household work. In the urban areas, it's very different because there isn't that kind of outdoor space. So many children are confined to their homes, very often in cramped space, very often a single room for the entire family. And so what do? Well, simplifying a little, what you found is that the girls are helping with the work at home and the boys are watching TV or watching online videos on the smartphone or somewhere else. I'm simplifying a little, but you did find that a large majority of girls were mainly working at home and boys were watching TV or online content. And as you said, quite rightly, this is a kind of regendering of children, because in the school, they have a comparatively more gender neutral pattern of activity, but now they are back to this gender division of labor where the girls are working and the boys are watching online content. And then you pointed out in the report, I'm not sure you mentioned it in the presentation, but that there are serious consequences of this addiction to online content and television and videos and so on, including what you called screen dependency disorder. I think these consequences are probably much more serious than we realize today, because the problem is not just that children become addicted, they waste a lot of time, they may watch inappropriate content, they may be exposed to violence, they may lose their concentration abilities. These are some of the consequences. But I think on top of that now, there is the danger of manipulation, because, and this is a danger specific to social media. The big difference between social media and TV is that TV is just a one-way thing. I mean, you watch the content, it comes to you, you decide to watch it or not, and that's the end of it. But on social media, you're exposed to a two-way system where everything you do and watch is monitored all the time. And then the system acts on that, ostensibly to help you to see things that you want to see, but actually to manipulate you and to maximize the time that you spend on these social media. That's basically how the algorithms are designed. And one effect of that, one effect of this constant effort to make you spend as much time as possible on these social media is to promote extremist content, because extremist content has a better chance of attracting your attention than dull news and programs. So I think there's a big danger there that we are only beginning to discover, and that may have done much more damage than we think. So these are some of the things that I take away from this very useful study. I really think that we must wake up to the gravity of the situation. We need much more investment in the education recovery, not just for the next few weeks or even the next few months, but for the next few years, because, you know, the children are now very poorly prepared to go back to school, and especially to go back to a grade 2 years ahead of the grade in which they were enrolled earlier. So we must adapt the curriculum. In fact, the National Education Policy includes a commitment to simplify the curriculum. This may be a good time to do it. And not only that, we need also a range of support measures going well beyond the kind of short-term bridge courses that are being organized now in most states, or we have to give children more time to get back on track. So I think most importantly, what we must try to do is to put underprivileged children at the center of education policy, because that is what is really lacking today. The entire focus is on privileged children, on online education, on going back to square one or to business as usual, which suits the privileged children because they are more or less on track, but it's a catastrophe for the poorer children. So I think we must really demand that the policy is made for the underprivileged. I'll end on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Drees. I would now like to invite Professor Shanta Sinha to please share her views on the research as well.
Thank you very much. Vipla Foundation, Meenu Gupta, Latika Gupta, Meenu Thomas, for this occasion to look at children and their rights, their education, and also the wonderful research that you've done. I must also thank Jean for broadening the debate and talking about education and the crisis in the education system, especially for the underprivileged children, whether the elite care about children at all, whether the state cares about children at all. I mean, now it's so obvious that they don't care. I don't even see why we should ask whether they care. What comes out very clearly through the process of COVID and after is that there was no noise at any time by any state about what was happening to children and their predicament. So I think we start on the very clear fact that the state does not care for children. And we have to say that henceforth, we will have to put pressure on the state to see that the state actually what walks the talk. I mean, it used to have a rhetoric. Now it did not even have a rhetoric during COVID. And this is a very, very painful situation. The cost of inaction is going to be tremendous, horrific for children, their lives today and their lives tomorrow. So I would say that we will have to state things up front. There's no point in being diplomatic. We will have to tell them, look, this is the naked truth. This is what the elite in India is about. This is what the societal concern is about children. This is what the state is about. So and when John was speaking, I was very angry. I was very angry that he's so good in that way. He does not get emotional. He speaks facts. He speaks truth. He's so calm. But I know there is an inner fury that he has. And when he spoke, that fury came out of me. But why are we so silent in this country? Look at the study. What did it say? I think the emphasis on the fear, on the uncertainty, on the anxiety that children face, on them not knowing whether they will be in school or they won't be at school, whether they're going to be studying or not going to be studying. What kind of a predicament is it for children? That they don't know what? They don't know what is happening now. They don't know what the virus is about now, what has hit them. And on top of it, they're being infused with a kind of information through the social media or through those horrible messages that come, where they're becoming, in a way, we are creating monsters out of them. They're watching pornography, they're watching violence, they're watching movies that should not be, and they're sending messages to girls, stalking them, harassing them. We know that's happening in urban areas. In fact, it has also begun in towns and villages which are closer to the urban areas, where rural boys, I know about urban boys too, are sending terrible messages to girls. And that has made it even more difficult for girls to get out of their homes. And the parents have locked up their girls in their houses because of these kinds of messages that are coming through the media. So we have, in fact, deliberately created our boys as useless, horrific, horrendous persons who will be most unproductive and who will sort of hate themselves for what they have become as they keep growing up, and for no fault of theirs. So I think this is what my carry away from the study was about, as Jean says, about this emotional aspect. And I was quite surprised that when you asked the question about how many of them went to school, there was no school. So there's a question of them going to school. I didn't understand that. You said some 57% of 56.4% could not go to school. Where was the school for them to go to in the 18 months? And why did some of them say they couldn't go to school? Some of them said they went to school. I was kind of confused because there were no schools at that time. Or were there schools in Bombay? I don't know. There were no schools, especially in Telangana. There were just no schools. So how did they come up with those schools? And then also, I thought what came across was good for me from the studies about the girls, and it was happening everywhere. The kind of violence that there is on girls, the domestic violence especially, and that or whatever gains girls have made have been reversed due to this COVID. Many of the girls have been able to come up to 7th grade, 8th grade. Some have even gone up to the 10th grade. Of course, we were not dealing with that age group. Many of them have dreamt about their future, their aspiration for education. And even for doing this, coming up to 7th, 8th grade or to the 10th grade, they have to fight a lot. It's not easy for girls to come up to this level. But it seems that the COVID has reversed this trend. It would be far more difficult for these girls to make it than before. And I think we will have to somewhere have another study on the impact of COVID on reinforcing gender discrimination and patriarchy. The way they have been pushed into child marriage, the way they have been pushed into domestic work, the way they have been pushed into child labor. I know about that in rural areas. I'm not very clear about the urban because there was no work at all in urban in that sense. In rural areas, they would all rush to cotton farms, to chili farms, to pricking a lime, all kinds of work. And the girls had it the worst, who went along with the mother. And in the name of safety, the mothers would take the girls along with them to farm work. So I think we will have to look at the issue of girl children far more seriously on their fears, their anxieties, how it has sort of broken their dreams and their aspirations for education. And it cannot be even the token Beti Bachao uh, has to become something else. We know that Beti Bachao is a nonsensical program, but we will have to think very, very hard about what we have to do with our girls and take it up front of the issue of gender discrimination and patriarchy. It's such a stubborn presence, and even organizations that have been working on gender discrimination have found it difficult to protect girls during COVID. I think that has to become a focus. Then I also thought that it was important to look at what schools are for the privileged, underprivileged children. One thing that the COVID did was it showed us that even a sort of non-functioning school or a dysfunctioning school is still so important for the poor. We all the time I kept personally criticizing schools, and I often said that what would have nothing, we would lose nothing if they closed the schools, they paid holiday for the teachers, and still nothing would be lost. Because in any case, nothing is happening in schools. But then when the schools actually closed, the truth came out very clearly that schools performed many, many functions. For me, the important function the schools that performed was it was a safe place for children. It kept children away from, as you had shown, exploitation. It kept children away from child labor, kept children away from child marriage. And as Jean said, it kept children in a space where there was some semblance of gender neutrality. The kind of discrimination one faces at home does not happen there. Schools became spaces where there was noon meal scheme. The kind of hunger, even now when I visit the villages and go around, even in urban towns, children have become thin. And if you ask them what kind of food you eat now and what kind of food you ate when the schools were open or when there was no COVID, you will find the substantive difference in the kind of food that they are eating now. They have this kind of a broken rice and some amount of onion and some chili powder. There is no oil. There is no even that tamarind isn't there. Even that dal isn't there. I think the schools were really space where children had some kind of a food and a predictability that they would have food. There's so much hunger going on. And so schools were safe spaces, schools were spaces of gender neutrality, schools were spaces that gave noon meals program, schools were spaces where there was a routine. You had spoken about the routine of children. Children woke up, they packed their bags, they walked to school, they had the whole day in school, they came back, then they may have worked or not worked, but it did have a routine. And what happened is that what you have said, that routine was totally collapsed once the schools were closed. Look at the contribution schools made, that it gave a child a routine, something predictable to know that tomorrow I have to do this. And that I thought was very important about what schools were about. And to me, schools were also important. I think that came out very clearly that schools were public spaces available for public scrutiny. You could go to a school and question and say, what has happened to these children? Why was this child beaten up? Why is this child not coming to school? Why is this child not happy? They were public spaces, especially our government schools. And you could question, you could scrutinize. Now here, the COVID situation invisibilized children totally. You had to do studies to find out what's happening to children. You and me, all of us know what was happening to children because we're dealing with children, we're dealing with education. But for those who are in power, for those who are in establishment, they need to know. And I'm sure they also know, but then it's so important to have evidence-based knowledge today. The research has become a site for contestation of power, for contestation for resources. And we will have to show them the evidence, even if there's a hungry child, That's not evidence enough. You'll have to show your statistics, your numbers, and you'll have to say large resource, data to say that children are unhappy. Otherwise, they're not going to believe. So it's so important to do research. This kind of research is absolutely important. Earlier, I would be very cynical about data and research, but let me tell you, now I think that they don't listen to us. Those voices don't matter. The only voice that will matter is of those who are doing solid research on behalf of the world to reach the establishment. And I'm so glad that you brought out this research. I'm also glad that Shaw is also coming up with so many studies to push the factor that children have to be heard and that during COVID they cannot be invisibilized. But again, coming back to the issue of why schools has become very, very obvious. And if there are no schools, there would be greater damage for the lives of children and greater set of inequalities. Already there are a huge number of inequalities. You'll have multiple dimensions of inequalities. You'll have added dimensions of inequalities to contend with if the schools don't reopen. Now, let me come back to the
Professor Sinha, you've gone on. Yeah.
Yeah. It just got muted. No, I just thought that now that schools have reopened, and for 18 months these schools were not being seen at all. They've grown forests around the schools now. Nobody cared for it. There were cattle sheds, there were goat sheds, there were people who were drinking in the school premises, there were cobwebs around, there were no toilets. Somewhere as if nothing happened, that you went from one amnesia, you had a dream sequence in between that was unreal. What was real was there was school, 18 months of unreal, and then the schools reopened as if nothing happened, and children will all come chalenge now. Let's go to school and enjoy. There's no school there. There are no toilets there. There's nothing there. And the kitchen where they would cook the meals, that has collapsed. Somebody's taken away the asbestos sheets on the kitchen and run away. The vessels aren't there. So, it is not the same school. And government has to invest. And I'm shocked that they've even reduced 10% of the total budget. In fact, it should have increased 50% to make school what it was 2 years ago. And you find that while this is happening, children from private schools are coming to the government schools. I do not know about other places, but I must tell you there's a data terrorism going on. There's a computer terrorism going on today. A child is not given an admission in a government school till the child's name is cancelled in that private school. And this child's parents will have to go back to the private school, say, please cancel my child's name, otherwise I will not get admission here. And the private school will not cancel till the arrears of all the fees are paid for the past 18 months. So what kind of a right is this? For the 6th class, a child who was in 4th, he somehow magically comes to 6th class, and then the child cannot get back to the government school because its name is registered as a child in a private school. I tell you, the data that is in the government box, the computer data, has to be burnt, dismantled. We do our research, and this data has to be held at the Gram Panchayat level. There, the data is data of names of children. They're not statistics, they're real life, they're sentient beings. They have a heart, they have a lung, they have eyes, and they're struggling for education. And I think we have to fight for demolishing the computerization of school. I mean, one should do a study. I would request you, Vipla Foundation, to please make a study on how computerization of information on education has falsified data, has taken away the rights of children, and how they're suffering. They want to go to school, but they cannot. And this data is horrible. I must say, in Bihar, their money is transferred to the bank towards their school, bags and books and everything. But they cannot open an account at the bank till they have an Aadhaar card. And that Aadhaar card simply cannot happen. And the name in the Aadhaar card would be different. The name in the school register would be different. Date of birth in Aadhaar card is different. Date of birth in the school register is different. It never matches. Because it never matches, the child does not exist. Because the child does not exist, there is no question of entitlement to the child. Somewhere, I think we will have to question the kind of ways in which each education department in most of the states is denying children their right to education. This is slightly going off tangent, but I must tell you that the computers have, in post-COVID situation, the computers have played havoc with children. They are still running from pillar to post, seeking admission to government schools. Migrant labor children, they've gone back, their names got cancelled, they've come back, the names are not there. So there's a missing children, so many in Hyderabad city. We went to about 2 schools looking at the attendance registers and just looking at the names of children in that attendance register to find out if those children are there around. We didn't have to make a new research. There's already an attendance register with names of children. 20% of these children were missing. Parents were available. Children were not there. Where have they gone? All that one has to do is verification of attendance registers. Go to a school. You don't have to do a fresh survey on out of school children and in school children. Go to a school, look at the attendance register, see if children are coming or not. And for those children who are not coming, track them, find out if they're in school or not in school. And you find that some girls, we found in another case of Mehboob Nagar, these children have gone as migrant labor to about 300 kilometers away on a chili farm. These were children studying in 9th and 10th grades. And they have gone. And I'm sure the government knows it. I'm sure the Labour Department knows this. To start on a premise that the government does not know is being very naive. They know what is happening, but they have to be told through research, because otherwise they will not believe what we are saying is true. While this is the plight of children, the other thing is about what kind of lessons that are going on. Imagine a 6-year-old, 7-year-old child is sitting in a classroom with 80 other children. There's only half a teacher. Suddenly, these teachers say there are so many children who are coming now to school who are young, we can't handle. And these children are coming because all those little private schools have closed down. And these teachers are just not able to handle these children. They don't know what to do. At the school we went, they've asked all the children to put their finger on the lip and sit down like that with their hands folded. That's all is happening there. There is a deep, deep crisis in the education system. It's not a crisis in learning at all. It's a crisis in the education system. And as Jean says, children and their education should become center stage for India's democracy. If we do not act on children and their education, it will cause a huge damage to children. I'm not talking about damage to the nation. I'm talking about damage to children. What will happen to them? What will happen to their lives? What will happen to their today? What will happen to their future? We'll have to think hard on the kinds of damage that can happen because the state doesn't care. And how do we make the voices of children the voices of establishment? I think that is where researchers are so, so very important. I'm so glad you asked me to talk. I do not know. I didn't come prepared with point 1 to 10. I just spoke the way I thought it was flowing. I can go on rant about what is happening, but thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, for listening to Jean, and I look forward to listening to Professor Krishna Kumar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Shanta Sinha. The pleasure is all ours. It's wonderful to hear you, and very, very insightful. Professor Krishna Kumar, I would like to invite you now to please speak on the issue. I would just ask you to unmute. Yes.
Thank you very much. There is so much to absorb and learn, both from the study as it was presented and from the discussion that we have had so far with Professor Drez and Professor Sinha. I'm still absorbing the findings and the discussion that they have initiated on the broader parameters of this subject. Basically, what the study has done is to help us to recognize the ethos in which our schools are now beginning to reopen. Now, when we say schools are reopening, it feels like an administrative kind of thing, that a lock is being opened, the gates will now open, and a resumption of a certain routine will take place. The study makes us realize that the resumption of schooling is not going to be a simple matter. In fact, it's going to be a matter that will require fairly drastic exercise of social imagination and a very sophisticated handling, a very complex handling of the situation that those of us who work in education or who are concerned about education live in. This new ethos is going to be far more difficult to study, decipher, and the issues that emanate from it are going to be so much more difficult than where we were recognizing the issues arising out of the Right to Education Act some 11 years ago. There is no question that historically we are in a very tight spot. The study helps us to reconstruct this present-day ethos from the perspective of childhood and from the perspective of real children in a certain part of the country. There is a difference in the two perspectives in the sense that real children are responding to this new ethos depending on where they are. As Professor Drez very rightly pointed out, there is the reality of the rural child, and there is a even more complex reality of the urban or a child belonging to an area of urban India, which is very heavily pressed by circumstances, both economic and social. So the geography is very important for this study. And in any case, during this long period, we have missed out, seriously missed out, even in terms of COVID figures like infection rates and death rates, etc. We missed out on this geography of the coronavirus, because anyone who has survived this long period trying to keep in touch with things in different parts of the country would know that the virus affected different parts, different regions differently. And the same can be said about the whole world. But within India, which is a very diverse country, both socially and geographically, the geography of the COVID pandemic was very important, which despite this high degree of our ability to use digital technology, remained a bit out of our reach. There is no reason why we don't quite know what was the density of the virus infections in specific villages. India has 6.5 lakh villages. If digital technology is capable of handling such complex data, why don't we know exactly how it affected different locations? And then perhaps we can understand a lot more about what to do now. But that's a separate matter. What the study has brought out, of course, is a whole new perspective from the point of view of childhood. And it reminds us that childhood hasn't yet become a social category for our nation. It remains essentially a biological category. Had it become a social category, and we had begun to kind of delude ourselves when RTE was approved, that perhaps now it's going to become a social category very soon, a category in which children don't need to be brought up into the social discourse each time some crisis happens, but rather we know that childhood is a very important stage of human life, and therefore it deserves the same kind of understanding and recognition that any other stage requires. And then within the childhood stage, there are very important stages within it, which any serious policy must recognize. This study reminds us of this very big gap in our imagination, that we really are unable to, as a nation, as a society, we still are unable to see the significance of childhood in shaping human life and shaping national social life. It has raised very important sort of subjects for further discussion and inquiry, starting from economic loss to psychological trauma. In between somewhere is the question of this long gap in studies, which resulted from school closure. Everyone knows that education of children cannot compensate for income losses. Education cannot compensate for such bigger crises in such a primary subject like the economy. All that education does is to make life capable of being projected into the future, whereas economic data help us to look at life as it is today. And that's where the critical duty, you can say, of those of us who work in education and the rest of the social scientific community lies, to be able to look at the future meaning and implications of income losses incurred today. Now, this was a period in which, to some extent, everyone became aware that the poor were hard pressed. One saw them walking hundreds of miles, thousands of kilometers during the lockdown. And wherever you were in the country, you knew that they were losing jobs. There was no work available now for the same income that they had before the pandemic, which in any case was meager. Now, this study brings out the implications of that for childhood. Early childhood will have different implications. Middle childhood will have different implications. And that is where I think the study brings us some enriched understanding of childhood itself. That for the little child who depends on the family, who depends on an Anganwadi, who depends on a school teacher for a variety of needs that early childhood has. This was a period when all these sources of nourishment were withdrawn. And there's also the stage of life when you don't make sense of such things. Why did these resources got withdrawn so dramatically? A small child cannot understand. And that is itself a traumatizing experience if some understanding had begun. A sudden withdrawal of a certain resource is quite a difficult experience for a small child to handle. But the middle level child, a grade 3, 4 kind of child, for that child, this long gap in studies has had very different and equally difficult, in many cases, disastrous implications. The study has brought out that they had no access to study material, for instance. They had no access to their teacher. And instead, they had full exposure to this medium that we, despite such a long history, we still don't fully recognize for its very mixed and in most cases very difficult effects, namely the television, their dependence on television to while away time, especially in the kind of setting in which this study was done. Yes, we do need more inquiry, and Professor Sinha has laid the ground for that inquiry as to what all have they internalized during this period from the kind of television programming that we have in India. What all have they internalized as a result of the exposure to social media? Or you can say this exposure under compulsion of circumstances to this space, which is literally a ferocious jungle, the space called social media. We will need to study that far more carefully in different settings of our country if we wanted to make sense of what this middle childhood has experienced and where it's coming from when it comes back to school. Because school is not just about delivering ideas, delivering information. School is about being with children. And in this engagement with childhood, that the teacher plays a very crucial role in national and social setting, which our country has not recognized. There are absolutely any number of indicators of that. The teacher is also an exhausted person as a result of this compelled duty in an online mode. Only somebody who has never been a teacher of children or younger people can say that the online mode was a substitute. This is you can say it's the most ironical understatement that you could possibly make. Teaching in the life of a teacher is a source of nourishment, but teaching online is a source of exhaustion, a daily sense of exhaustion, of not being able to do what you had chosen to do in your life. And therefore, we must recognize and we need to have studies of how teachers coped with this period and how they're still coping with it. Post-COVID era hasn't really begun. Online teaching is still regarded as the preferred mode in so many institutions all over the place. What it means to the teacher. The teacher's voice in any case was always a kind of a muted voice. And it's not easy to unmute it. It's very difficult to unmute the teacher today and expect that the teacher will suddenly start speaking out. No, I think organizations like your foundation will have to work on this matter, how to bring back the teacher into the educational space so that we understand who is this resource who is now going to absorb all the messages that your study has revealed, and who on the basis of those messages is now going to conduct her or his professional life afresh. We must understand that teachers' preparedness, that teachers' experience, the kind of empathy that you have shown for mothers, for children, will have to now turn towards the teacher, empathetically understanding where they are today. I know personally dozens of my former students who have served 8 to 10-hour duties at vaccination centers for the last so many months now. Suddenly on November 1 in Delhi, they were asked to resume duty because the school had suddenly reopened. Some of them told me that there was not even water available in school that day. Nobody had swept the surface. Nobody had paid any attention to what it will mean to receive even a few children in a classroom. Such was the scale of unpreparedness. Now, many teachers served in absolutely amazingly irrelevant jobs from the perspective of a teacher's understanding. jobs at airports, for example, jobs on street corners, managing transport, for example, and so on and so forth. The Indian teacher is basically a karmchari who can be deployed into anything from election duties to managing, noting down how many trucks are coming into the city and so on. And so this period has been a period when teachers ceased to be teachers, even though they were forced to maintain online kind of work and contact with children. The teacher is an exploited category of service, both in the government and private sector. But in this period, that kind of status went many notches high. And today, if we want to imagine that the teacher will be able to assist the child in readjusting to the grade level where the child finds herself, or if we expect that the teacher will be able to develop a new curriculum which adjusts for this long gap in the child's studies, we must check our understanding of where the teacher is after this pandemic. To what extent can teachers register the psychological experience that the study is talking about is itself a very big question, because teacher training, pre-service teacher training, has never been a strong sector. Understanding of children's psychology has been very superficial in teacher training, even in the best of programs. Now, for the kinds of issues you are raising about the implications of various kinds of deprivation and exposure to these media that even we adults don't quite fully understand. For a teacher to understand the reality of childhood today requires far more than sensitization. This word sensitization, I think, is terribly overused now, and it cannot offer us the kind of ground that we are hoping to furnish for moving from this point onwards into making education vibrant and relevant again. The ethos that we had experienced in the early years after RTE was approved, that ethos has simply vanished. That ethos had already begun to get jaded. And now this experience of COVID has almost mauled and thrown away that ethos. I used to meet so many people who had never fully grasped the meaning and implications of the Right to Education Act, why it was such a radical departure in social history of India. They rarely understood. Very few had seriously read Chapter 5 in that act to recognize why it's a very different kind of vision for childhood and children at school, etc. There's a whole range of things that RTE had managed to create in a short period in terms of social awareness, and its contribution to social imagination was enormous. Now that advantage has now been fully lost, and we will have to start from scratch, literally from scratch. And for an organization like the Vipla Foundation, this is a very, very important activity for the coming years. How to reconstruct the RTE ethos in the context of the kinds of issues that you have raised, implications of income loss on such a radical scale, implications of this long gap in studies in children, implications of this long school closure for teachers' mental health, as well as motivation, as well as commitment to their profession, and so on, when they have been so poorly treated by various levels of government in terms of how they were deployed during this period. In many states like Uttar Pradesh, we learned how they themselves were so vulnerable to the COVID pandemic, and reports indicate how many teachers actually died and how much difficulty their families experienced in getting any kind of compensation as a result of their death. Then the implications of the psychological trauma that children have suffered. The new for us to be able to make that palpable for teachers, principals, school managers in various settings is going to be a very, very important exercise, creating palpability of such data for the person who is now going to be on that front, where those children are there, and as Professor Sinha very pictorially described, there are many more children who have been pushed out of private schools and they are in the government school space now. So, and then there is the new reality of an unknown number of children having been forced to drop out. That old word, which had lost its relevance, is back to us. The system has dropped them, has kind of dumped them, you can say. And various categories that we knew in it are likely to become meaningful again. We know that that category is going to include vast numbers of girls, bigger number of girls than boys, but even many boys too will have been inducted into the workforce at an early age. We know that vulnerable sections of society will have far greater proportion of such children who have been dumped by the system. Children in tribal belts, children of the lowest rung of the caste system, the scheduled castes, and even peasant background children, and so on. We can well imagine all that. And the implications of that will have to be fully grasped by the teacher. This is not a matter of some in-service program, which can be offered for 3 days to reopen schools. This is a matter of very sustained and intensive education, re-education of the teacher. If we want the teacher to be able to address these over the next 3 to 5 years. As many have pointed out in the world, in many other countries, the implications of the coronavirus are going to be with us for a long time. The specific educational implications have also been drawn out by, for example, UNESCO in a recent issue of their journal Prospects, which has tried to create the groundwork for a curriculum that can accommodate both the experience of the pandemic as well as knowledge about it and its implications for various subjects of study. This new curriculum cannot be a simpler version of the old curriculum in any meaningful sense. It has to be more complex curriculum, which is able to integrate the experience and its implications with subject knowledge in different areas like language learning, like mathematics, or like social sciences, and of course, science itself. Then alone will the memory of the pandemic become less traumatizing for children. We have experienced this pandemic as adults of various ages, but children have experienced it as children. And we don't quite have the imagination to understand what that meant. And this study has just scratched that surface for us, has begun to make us think. And we need many more studies like that before we will be able to draw all its implications for systemic reform, for this new reality that surrounds our children, the new ethos that schools will have without question, that they will have to face, and in which they will have to now function. We knew what our system was like, particularly before SSA. Say 20 years ago, 25 years ago, the system was sharply social Darwinist. What does that mean? It means that survival of the fittest theory was very crudely implicated or embedded in the education system. Its main characteristics that had evolved over 150 years were intact. And for the first time, SSE had begun to kind of slightly dent them. And then came the RTE, which dented those characteristics even more. And we got used to the idea of a system which was actually improving. But now is the moment for us to recognize those chief characteristics of the education system again, because the pandemic has again strengthened them. It has revived that old system. Now, very briefly, what was that old system and its social Darwinism? Its first characteristic was that it ignores the weak child in the class, weak child in the society, the weaker. The word weaker is very interesting because it hides the source of the weakness. Is it because it's socially underprivileged class that a child behaves in this manner that is clubbed or is called a weak child, or is academically weak, is weak in English or weak in mathematics, which is a product of the system itself, etc. We don't go into those debates today, but the characteristic of the system was to ignore the weak, marginalize the vulnerable, and lionize the strong. This is the full picture of the ideology of social Darwinism, that you ignore the weak, let the weak survive at best as it can with the help of tuitions or with the help of cramming or whatever. Marginalize the vulnerable, in the sense that don't waste your time. Every teacher knew that, if not from training, that from experience, that if you spend too much time with the vulnerable child who is vulnerable for various reasons, then you won't be able to get good results that principal and the government officers and directorates like. So if you want to survive as a teacher and make some sense of your career, then you marginalize the vulnerable from your own effort and imagination. Don't spend too much time with it. And the third characteristic was you lionize the strong. If a child is good at something, well, let that child get most of the opportunity of responding in a classroom, or all the resources that may be available in the school. Let the strong benefit so that their achievement lends its glory to the school itself. Now, that was what the social Darwinism of the system was, that SSA and RTE attempted to dent, and to some extent succeeded in denting. These two major social events or policy events of our recent history softened the system a little bit. Now that effect, unfortunately, has gone. It's like if you don't sustain sort of some very important medicine, then the benefit doesn't last. And that's what has happened. We are, in a way, in a pre-SSA world again. We are back in the you might say 80s, or even further back in terms of our understanding of how best to handle school children. The best symptom of that I can offer you as a proof is that this month, this first reopening month of schools, unfortunately, there is news that a national achievement survey is going to be conducted by the National Resource Organization with which I was associated once. And in states like Madhya Pradesh, circulars have been issued to prepare children for this National Achievement Survey. Many states are vying for best possible results in their states. The survey is, of course, not done on a universal basis, but on sample basis. But the concern is not the child. The concern today is how this achievement survey will rank order the states. Now, such is the force of the old system, which RTE had tried to soften by pointing out through various clauses in it that the concern of education has to be, the chief concern has to be the child's experience and not results, not the outcomes. The whole focus of RTE was on the child's experience. We have to restore that focus in our attempts to get back into reform mode for the next few years. And I totally agree with Professor Sinha and Professor Drez that research will play a big role in this, this attempt to restore the reform energy which SSA and RTE had generated after such a long dominance of social Darwinism in the system. Research will play a very major role, and this research will have to find new sites, will have to disperse itself all over our very diverse geography, and will have to kind of reveal more and more of what you have in this study revealed, namely the experience of the child as it has been shaped by this pandemic and all the social and policy neglect of the child during this pandemic, of which so much evidence you have already generated. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kumar. And thank you all the panelists. Latika, is there anything that you would want to add at this point?
No, we can simply take the questions now.
All right. Okay. So thank you, Professor Drace, Professor Krishna Kumar, and Professor Shanta Sinha. This has been very wonderful and a lot of food for thought personally for me and to all the participants who have joined in. We will now move on to the Q&A section. I would request our participants to please type their questions in the chat box that you can see and type it to everyone so that we can take a few questions and our panelists can answer them.
There are no questions.
I have a question.
Uh,
Is it okay?
Yes,
I would
yes.
like Professor Krishna Kumar to also comment on this disastrous online intervention that has happened. You did talk about how it has affected the teachers, but generally, how would you respond to this kind of intervention and what its implications would be for not just the poor, but for all children in the country? I mean, I would like to know a little more about the implications of online education. You need to unmute yourself, Professor.
sorry, I'll do that.
Is that okay?
Yes.
I think, first of all, we have to unpack this word, online education. It hides so many things. Even the term digital divide hides so much. Professor Drez was pointing out how crucial a difference it makes in terms of where you are receiving this online education to begin with. Your location as a student makes all the difference. Then the question of the device. The gap is not just in terms of accessibility or connectivity, which of course there is, but also in terms of the device through which you are accessing online learning. The experience is completely different if you are accessing it on a computer screen or a laptop screen, as opposed to on a smartphone screen. The experience is different. The level of mental and ocular exhaustion it causes, the kind of concentration it requires, all that is different in terms of the device on which online education is received. And then, of course, the question is of the kind of interaction that the person who is delivering so-called this online education, the kind of experience the person has, the kind of training that person has. In fact, online teaching is far, far more demanding, you can say, if you want to bring it even half on a par with classroom teaching. And the manner in which our teachers were suddenly pushed into delivering those lessons was truly an example of terrible sort of mechanistic administrative thinking with which we as a country handle education. No, I think even if the best of online education were to be provided, it will still be totally unsuitable and inappropriate for small children. In no country in the world has this experiment been done on such a scale for smaller children. The meaning of online education is very different for higher education as opposed to smaller children in primary levels. So its efficacy for, say, grade 11, 12, or undergraduate and postgraduate education is one thing. And we need to discuss that separately. But at the lower level of the educational ladder, it really is impossible to justify it, especially in the light of issues that RTE has foregrounded, the light of issues that the curricular reforms earlier this century had highlighted, etc. Importance of hands-on experience, for example. Importance of activities that have to be physically undertaken. And online learning simply cannot handle that. And this has been proved as far as studies go, has been proved in several countries in the world, and results have been published in very important journals. For example, a study in Harvard Education Review about 4 years ago pointed out that despite a very sincere effort made in a certain county in the United States to use this mode for enriching learning, the results were extremely disappointing, and that it was found to be totally inappropriate for elementary level children. So for it to be regarded as a future mode is talking about, talking something that can only be described as sort of some kind of perverse idea, a future mode for school education. In fact, one has been very worried already about the extent to which the smart class movement has pervaded the country's private schools. Smart classes have been a bad idea, a waste of money, according to the experience of many countries. I particularly bring before you the country of Japan, which has every reason to be techno-happy or techno-romantic, but is not, and has resisted smart classes all that way in the previous years. Already smart teaching and its inefficacy for the kinds of goals that RT has set up for learning has been proved repeatedly in several countries. And therefore, if we are talking about online learning for school children, at best, we can see it as a supplement at the senior secondary stage and nothing earlier than that. And even at that stage, only as a supplement, which it already is in many ways, because the internet has so many resources to offer for the teenage child, apart from so many other very problematic exposures that it offers to the teenage child. I mean, that debate I don't want to get into, but I hope I have responded to your question.
There is a question about did we find any starvation cases? We interviewed children on a telephone, not exactly starvation, but food hardship came across as a salient theme. And there were several instances in which the interviewers had become very emotional because children reported, or children also ended up crying during the interviews when they said they didn't have even a single pencil or a notebook or whatever they thought their possessions in terms of their identity as a child, as a student of a school. So that was one experience we did have in many cases, but starvation, it was beyond the scope of the study.
And what about the question that Professor Sinha had asked about school, access to school when schools were not there at all? Can there be some clarification on that now?
Yes, Professor Drees has already given. We didn't ask about access to school. We asked them, what did you miss most during this time? So they said they missed going to school. They missed playing with their parents or friends in the neighborhood or their school classmates. And they missed being with their teachers.
Okay.
Because a lot of people claim or think that children were happy staying at home. So we didn't find that. We found they were missing that experience.
Okay, thank you.
And just to add to it, in the communities that we had taken the data from, we had like Vipla Foundation, because we work with these communities, we had provided them with groceries. So we had made a lot of relief efforts at our end and ensured that the families that we work with, which was not a great number, I would say, but still the sample that we worked with do have basic groceries to sustain themselves, because a lot of these families were, the parents were daily wage earners and they had lost their jobs during the pandemic.
There is a question for Professor Drays. What
Yes.
would be your suggestion to strengthen civic cooperation under such circumstances?
Okay, let me try to answer. I'll have to leave, unfortunately, after that.
Sure.
It's a very difficult question. I was myself quite surprised to find during this survey that we did in the month of August, how little people had done to help themselves and each other. I think to some extent it's a general problem in Indian society of lack of solidarity and mutual cooperation, which is to some extent related to the caste system, because the caste system divides people. And in a village where there are people of different castes, including oppressed castes and oppressive castes, obviously you don't easily expect any kind of community initiative, whether it's in education or other fields. But the thing is that it's not just within the villages. Sometimes within the caste, we do find a lot of solidarity and mutual support. But in this case, even within the caste, or sometimes even within the extended family or the family, we found that there was a kind of inertia. So that I don't fully understand myself. But I do think that one thing that has made things worse is that by closing the schools for so long, the government gave a terrible message that you can relax for now. You know, baad mein dekha jayega. For now, you don't need to study. That's the kind of thing, the kind of message that went out. And online was just a kind of, that was tokenism, and people saw it as tokenism. They didn't take it seriously. So the message went that for now, it's okay, we can relax. And I think that is one possible reason why people didn't do more to help themselves and to help each other, because I think they could have done quite a lot more, at least within the family or the neighborhood, you know, to organize coaching, tuition, or even just to sit, you know, in each other's homes and try to read the textbook together or something or the other. And I was quite surprised. Of course, I only participated in the survey in Jharkhand, so perhaps it was not as bad in other states. But we didn't see much evidence at all from this survey, which covered 15 states, of much community initiative to help the children who are being deprived of access to schooling. So this is all I can say. Unfortunately, I will have to leave, but thank you all very much for this very enlightening discussion. And I have myself a lot of questions, which I would really like to discuss, especially with Krishna, Kumar, and Shanta Sinha. But I guess it will have to be for another occasion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Drays. Lovely having you with us.
Thank you.
There is a question for Professor Kumar. What different kinds of studies we need to envisage going forward? What are the...
This question has been partly answered by our other two panelists, and a few ideas I've already given. I think one, of course, is the areas which this study has already opened up. We need deeper inquiries, especially on this psychological trauma that so many children have suffered, psychological distraction that they have gone through, the impact of the social media on them. We have hardly any studies in our country on that, for its impact of exposure to, or free exposure to, unsupervised exposure to YouTube or Facebook, etc. for different age groups. What does it mean? What do they watch? How do they make sense of it? There are studies in many parts of the world, but not in our country, on video game industry on childhood and children of different ages. We do need urgently such studies. And on the basis of such studies, then we can have some idea of what to do about this menace of so much violence on video games, and which is circulating under the, this very strange label called a game. Is violence a game? Is aggression simply a part of sport in this mode? And so on and so forth. All those questions research alone can bring into discourse. At the moment, they are kind of part of some sort of discourse of the concerned people, but the discourse has very little to back it and push it into the public sphere. Then, of course, on the question of impact on teachers, this how they experience it. You have also, in this study, pointed out the importance of understanding the virus and so on. I mean, there's a very huge area of, because health education in any case was a very marginalized area of the Indian curriculum. If you asked, 10 teachers the difference between a bacteria and a virus, or which diseases are caused by a bacteria, which ones by virus, why is a virus-caused disease more difficult to treat? Very little knowledge might be found, even among teachers, let alone even older children. Forget about lower children, smaller children. So this whole range of issues that the pandemic has brought out before us about health education, we need to rewind this whole thing and again try to make health education a priority area of the curriculum, which it has never been. I know some institutions in the city of Mumbai tried to do that some time back, but these are very limited efforts, and we need to think much more about it now that we have been hit so hard by a virus, and all these routines that became part of sort of social understanding of this virus, like hand washing and mask wearing and so on and so forth, were mostly without any clear understanding of how they help. And therefore, already we are beginning to see a recession in these habits. And mask wearing, of course, continues to be a very big problem, even in very crowded settings in our cities. And therefore, it continues to pose a very problem, a serious prospect for the recession of the virus right now. So these are some of the areas in which the study foregrounds as fit subjects for further and deeper, more intensive inquiry.
There is a there is a techno-romantic question. Is online learning not a good option to reach out students sitting in remote areas by focusing on network connections?
So this is a recurring questions with a couple of people. Like, if not online education, what should have we done at the time when lockdown was there and schools were closed? Now it's opening up, but what would have been, or if the circumstance happens going ahead, what will we do in such a situation? If not online education, how do we make education accessible for children, especially in remote areas, or otherwise also if schools are closed?
Well, if you're asking me to respond to it, I think some response has been given by Professor Drez, that in the social messaging, which was done on such a big scale for hand washing, had there been some messages about, please help the child if you have an educated older brother in your family.
Right.
That messaging itself would have reminded people that children need work with their existing textbooks. There was no reason why other textbooks could not be made available to children after a few months.
Yeah.
Institution like Bodh in Rajasthan, for example, undertook a very important program right in the first lockdown, where they trained a group of people in villages who would take some lessons from a teacher and then sit children down in groups of 7 or 8 under trees in a village and take those lessons, take those classes with them. And this was sustained over several months. I have seen a whole documentary on how it was sustained. Now, it's also true that in that period, in the first lockdown period, even though it was very much apprehended that the virus will spread across the countryside, it didn't. And we still don't understand what happened. As I said to you in my presentation, we don't have enough data on the geography of the spread of the virus, even across the world, why certain countries were spared at some point and why certain countries became very intensive epicenters of the virus at another point. But within our country, where there's so much difference in geography, many villages didn't have a single case in many cases. I tried to keep in touch with about 10 villages. For several months, there were absolutely no cases. And cases began to appear actually towards the end of the first year. Now, in that period, there was no reason. If we had a decentralized system of education where a teacher could take a decision about school reopening in the village itself, and if the teacher was living in the village and didn't have to commute from a nearby town, then such a teacher could well have been in a position to maintain, with social distancing and everything else, a modicum of regular teaching. Even once a week teaching would have been preferable to no teaching at all, especially if the village itself was fairly safe. There were so many villages that one heard about in news where the villagers were making sure that anybody who is coming from a city or is going out to a nearby town to, say, deliver milk or vegetables and comes back, that person is made to live at the periphery of the village. Villagers in many places had organized these quarantines, temporary quarantines, and so that cases don't emerge in the village itself. Now, those stories were there in the media at some point, and those reminded us that if this can happen, why can't the village teacher take some classes? So online education was far from the only option available for many schools out of the 1 million schools we have. I'm sure it was necessary in a part of the system, but in many other parts of the system, it was not the only option. Right. And we will receive more reports if we try to find how some of voluntary organizations try to maintain in some parts some degree of that kind of teaching.
Thank you, Professor Kumar.
Shanthaji wanted to.
Yeah.
No, I think Professor Krishna Kumar talked about it, the issue of decentralization and allowing teachers the autonomy to set up their own schools would have helped. And there are any number of examples in the country where voluntary organizations have set up village learning centers. At no time did the education department recognize these centers at all. They could easily have instructed the teachers to assist in running of these small centers with about 6 or 7 children. They could even have revived the noon meal programs. They didn't. I think the state sent a message that it is okay for children not to learn. That is what Jean Drèze had said so eloquently, that it's okay. It's okay. Just a matter of 2 years or 3 years. It's perfectly fine. I think that message went in more than the message that it's sad that children are not learning. The government should do something and leave it to the Gram Panchayats, leave it to the local teachers, leave it to the school management committee. There are already these institutions, local institutions who know about schools and children. Right. They could easily have given them the power to sort of take decisions and give them all support they needed to run those centers. Nothing happened.
Thank you, Professor Sinha.
The techno-romantic people want to know that isn't this an opportunity to connect our learner with global universities and train them to access those mediums of learning. Professor Kumar, this is a question for both of you.
Let me come in, Professor Krishna Kumar. First of all, I don't think this is education at all. You must know what the definition of education is before you even call online an education. I would demolish. Secondly, you cannot, this is another kind of, I would think, colonizing the mind. Teachers already are not thinking for themselves, as Professor Krishna Kumar has said. Now with the online thing, you don't need teachers according to them. Somebody else is thinking for you. So you are actually removing a whole layer of organic intellectuals as teachers who have the potential to do so much, and you decided that they're no good. They don't need to teach. We will have Baidus of the world. We'll have somebody of the world to think about what should happen in the classroom. It's a question of, we had this colonization, and we are still suffering from not being able to think. And now you have these online so-called education, which will remove some lakhs of teachers as thinking beings. I think it is dangerous. I think it should be banned totally. If it is necessary, as Professor Krishna Kumar says, it can be at the 11th grade or the 12th grade as a choice and not as a necessity, not as a substitute to a teacher, not as a substitute to a college or the student. In any case, if these children want to access that great education, they can always do it at a click of their WhatsApp or their media. It need not be promoted by the state. Sorry, Professor Krishna Kumar.
No, you've very eloquently answered that question. As the organizer, our anchor had said, it's a romantic question. And
romantic, I like the word.
I mean, romantic in the sense that it takes us into the domain of wishful thinking and fantasies about becoming global in our speech, etc. I mean, all these words need to be brought back into an analytical sphere, and for that we need a full-fledged seminar exactly on that, because all these words are kind of really impeding our objective thinking about what is teaching, what is learning, what does education mean. And as you rightly pointed out, our lack of ability to engage with these terms objectively has a lot to do with our having been colonized, because these discourses are not as popular in other societies. I've given you the example of Japan, where I try to keep in touch with some actual schools where none of these things that we have so sort of greedily grabbed have been allowed to seep into the school system. Even subjects like geography, forget about science, and language, are taught entirely by conventional means and walls on the map. And if you ask a principal, why not use the internet, because it has maps of every possible place, he says, no, we don't believe in those kinds of devices for learning, even at the senior secondary stage. Yes, that school does have a little room where computers are kept, but classrooms are entirely based on the teacher who is accessing children in a physical space through means like well-produced textbooks, the library resources, maps on the walls, and so on. We somehow, as a once colonized society, treat technology as a toy, and its toy value becomes the source of excitement for us. And we feel that we can leapfrog, but even leapfrogging is not required in this case. Because what we were trying to put in place as a result of RTE was a credible system, which will have certain norms and parameters, and where teachers would have certain understanding of what they were doing, where the rights of children will be properly respected and then translated into pedagogic work. We need not lose all that because we are so mesmerized by the toy value of this new technology. I don't think the subject needs much debate today, at least. In any case, our technological giant Zoom will say you have run out of time.
Yes, we are also about to say human beings. We can close. We can close.
Right.